Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilman is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 best epic cards to craft in the Witchwood meta. Now, I'm not saying these are all Witchwood cards. In fact, there are very few Witchwood cards on this list, but currently in the state of Hearthstone right now, I think these are the cards that are going to give you the best average value for your Hearthstone collection. As always, there are two different ways to craft: crafting for specific decks or crafting to just have a good all-around collection. And this is more for the well-rounded style of crafting. If you want to make a good deck, just go find a list, craft the cards you need, play that deck. If you're looking to build a well-rounded set of cards that will carry you through the next year or so and long into the future of Hearthstone in some cases, this is the kind of list for you. Now that means I will emphasize classic cards most of all here, or give a little bit of weight to cards that have a lot of time left in the standard format rotation so that you're going to be able to get some time out of them. I'm not going to ignore cards just because they rotate. If they're really good and are going to give you a lot of oomph right now and important parts of decks right now, then I'm still going to recommend that you craft some of those cards despite their timeline. Now, on top of all of that, there's one extra thing I need to discuss here. There are 3 cards that would certainly make this list, if not for the fact that they are about to get nerfed. That's right, this video coming out 2 days before the nerfs to things like Call to Arms, Spiteful Summoner, and Void Lord, specifically for the context of this video, on top of a few other things. But essentially, each of those are fantastic cards today, right now. Call to Arms, amazing in Paladin. Void Lord, fantastic in Warlock. Spiteful Summoner, empowering a couple different kinds of decks. Unfortunately, both Call to Arms and Spiteful Summoner are getting directly nerfed, so they may not be as good, and they may not be worthwhile. That said, they might still be okay. Frankly, they both look like they could be playable, even at their increased mana cost. So maybe keep an eye out for those. They might still belong on this list. Even after the nerf, you're going to have to use your own discretion. When it comes to Void Lord, the issue there is that not that Void Lord itself is getting nerfed, but that Possessed Lackey and Dark Pact are getting nerfed, which are both very high synergy cards of the Void Lord. So if, for instance, Cube Lock or Control Lock go away, Void Lord might not be good enough anymore. Might not be worth the craft in this case, although, once again, I kind of think it's still going to be good post-nerf, so it might be worth it. You'll have to use your judgment when it comes to crafting any of these 3 given cards. But when it comes to the other 10 cards on this list, the actual ones being named here, I do think they're going to be worth it. These are cards that you're going to get some play out of at some point. They're going to be important parts of decks today or potentially long in the future. That said, let's go ahead and jump into this list. Up first here we have Sea Giant, a neutral classic card, which is a big boon in this card's favor. Right now, it doesn't get played a ton necessarily. It's basically showing up in Even Shaman and occasionally in some other deck lists here and there. But nonetheless, this is a card that's a great one to have in your collection because it always shows up in some random deck here or there. It's also a great tech card of sorts against really aggressive wide board metas. Sometimes control decks, for instance, can slot this in, and it gives them a giant threat to counter pressure aggressive decks that go wide on the board. That way, it gets a super cost discount, and it's very playable. Beyond that, aggressive decks can run this, of course, too. And I've been doing this very successfully right now in a Zoo deck, running Sea Giant. If I'm running a lot of minions, my opponent are running a lot of minions, things like Paladins out there with all the 1/1s, Sea Giant's a good tech because I can often play it for 0 mana, 1 mana, 2 mana. So those metas and instances always show up in Hearthstone. There's been a lot of times this card has become a really smart tech addition to deck lists. I would say it's never been a core card necessarily for any given deck, but it's still a smart one occasionally, and that makes it a good tool to have. So a good card to have in your collection, if not the most important, certainly a reliable and somewhat consistent one. Moving on to the number 9 spot here, we have Gluttonous Ooze from Journey to Unguro. And yes, admittedly, this one only has 11 months left in its standard format rotation, but nonetheless, it's one of the most played epic cards in the game right now. I think it ranks at the number 5 or 6 spot, number 5 spot right now as far as epic played cards are concerned, so clearly a card that a lot of people are finding use for. Now, I think most notably, odd decks can use this as a weapon removal tool, particularly if you don't have an epic like Harrison Jones. This can slot in really nicely as a replacement. Beyond that, it's just a cheaper weapon removal, which is really good without access to acidic swamp ooze. So even though there are a few great weapon removal options, people still like to run this one because of its defensive potential. That gain from the armor here can make a huge difference in defensive style deck, a control deck that's looking to stay alive, that can be an enormous swing, taking a 4 attack weapon out of play and buffing yourself for 4 health. That's an 8-point heal, which is incredible when attached to a 3/3 body. So clearly it's pretty obvious why Gluttonous Ooze is a strong weapon removal option. And of course, weapon tech is always valuable in Hearthstone. Weapons are everywhere, particularly right now, seemingly weapons in every deck. Even slow control decks and non-weapon classes like Mage and Warlock are using weapons too. So ultimately, this is one of the better tech options that Hearthstone has available. Whether it's an odd deck or a control deck, there's probably some way you're going to be able to use this one. So up next here we have Druid's Ultimate Infestation, and this is actually the only class card on the list. Once again, Call to Arms and Voidlord maybe should have made the cut, but with the nerfs coming, who's to say whether they're going to be worth it? Now, Ultimate Infestation actually might get impacted by the nerfs as well, because this is currently used very successfully with Spiteful Summoner, and Spiteful Summoner's getting hurt. So maybe Ultimate Infestation will see a drop in play post-nerf, but regardless of that, this is just one of the strongest cards in the game, and almost every version of Druid has played Ultimate Infestation since it's come out, and I don't think that's going to change because this card is just so ridiculously overpowered and packs so much punch into a single card. The value is off the charts. Druid is a great class for this sort of tool, so if you ever plan on playing Druid, you just can't go wrong with Ultimate Infestation. Again, it does only have less than a year left as far as play is concerned, but in that time, it's going to be important for Druid. It's going to be a card that shows up in the meta, regardless of whether or not it makes the cut in this remaining Witchwood meta after the nerfs. It'll show up again in the next 2. So Ultimate Infestation, for Druid players in particular, is one of the safest cards to craft in the Epic slot, and frankly, for everybody else, it's still a good card to have, just because Druid is going to be a powerful class, and this one empowers it to an incredible degree. So moving on, we have the only Witchwood card on this list. This is the Voodoo Doll, and it's a great little tool for control decks to use. It serves as a neutral hard removal card, which doesn't exist very often. Things like Big Game Hunter have served that purpose in the past, but of course Voodoo Doll works against anything, not just stuff with high attack values. Now that said, Voodoo Doll's not perfect for every class because you do need a way to consistently kill your Voodoo Doll, but for things like Mage, that makes it incredibly strong because of their ping. Classes like Warlock can also use things like Defile very consistently with Voodoo Doll, and there are a handful of other ways, like Warrior, for instance, with Whirlwind. Different classes have ways to activate this thing. So that said, it's gonna see play for the future as far as I'm concerned. Even if things like Cube Lock fall out of fashion, Big Spell Mage will be right there to fill the gap. There are Warriors that can use this. So Voodoo Doll is just a great card that's going to be around in standard format for a while. This thing's going to find some play in your collection. Up next here we have the Primordial Drake, and I think this is really one of the best neutral taunt cards that Hearthstone has ever seen. Yeah, there are things like Lich King, sure, but Primordial Drake has just been played across so many different kinds of decks. And it's because that AoE is so good to counter aggressive metas. 2 damage is a really magic number. It kills a lot of different things. When you've got that 4/8 taunt body attached to it, that's usually an enormous swing turn. So most commonly today, this is seen in things like Dragon Control Priest, just to give them a dragon activator and a great late game stabilization style card, but that's certainly not the only kind of class that has ever run this. Lots of different decks in the control archetype have put this thing into play. The Whirlwind sets up perfectly for some classes, you know, setting up executes. It used to work pretty nicely with Sleep with the Fishes, for instance, with Warrior, but you don't even need to combo it just on its own right. It's a really good play. When you add Dragon Synergy into the mix, it becomes an even more interesting card. So Primordial Drake, a great tool to have for anybody that ever wants to play a slow kind of deck. So a good fit for most people's collections. And up next, we're going to move into the top 5 here, starting off with Carnivorous Cube. And of course, Carnivorous Cube has been most famously used lately in Cube Warlock, Cube Lock as it's most commonly known, to do just completely ridiculous things like create multiple Void Lords, kill you outright with tons of different Doom Guards. It combines with Death Rattle synergy things like Spirit Singer Umbra, for instance, for just ridiculous turns. But Cube Lock is not the only deck that has utilized Carnivorous Cube. There are lots of different ways to make this thing blow up for all kinds of crazy shenanigans. Taunt Druid, for instance, very successfully uses this with Witching Hour and Hadronox to create giant boards of taunts. Hunter decks can use this with all kinds of Death Rattle shenanigans and Big Beast shenanigans. So essentially, Carnivorous Cube has a played rate that's through the roof right now because of Cube Block specifically, but even if that died, and it might die after the nerfs, nonetheless, Carnivorous Cube is gonna see play. There are decks that are gonna find this because its effect is so unique and has so much raw power baked into it. This is the kind of card that's just gonna be a tool that becomes useful. It's gonna empower some deck down the road. It's a great one to have in your collection, a fun one to boot. You know, that's a great side effect too. When they're fun, that helps a lot. So Carnivorous Cube, you can't go wrong crafting this guy. He's not going to be around forever, admittedly, because it is a Kobolds and Catacombs card. It will rotate out in 11 months, but nonetheless, for those 11 months, you're going to have absurd amounts of enjoyment from this card, but also just a lot of power in this card as well. So as we move into the top 4 here, the rest of these cards are all going to be neutral classic cards, because at the end of the day, those are the cards that are going to give you the best return on your investment when it comes to Arcane Dust. These are going to be around forever. They're neutral cards that fit across multiple classes, which is awfully handy too, because you know somewhere along the line you're going to have some assortment of cards or a class that lines up with these cards nicely, giving them more flexibility essentially across your entire collection. Up first, as you can see, is the Merlok War Leader, and this guy's good because he is the ultimate Merlok, and Merlok decks have shown up time and time again in Hearthstone. Most notably lately is Merlok Paladin, a deck which I think stands to gain a lot of ground in the post-nerf meta, so Merlok War Leader might become immediately important if you want to play Merlok Paladin, but beyond that, he's the perfect Merlok. He's a great follow-up, he's a board builder, he's a finisher, he's a winner, he's got good stats on his own. When it comes to Murlocs, there's no card that's more important to have. So if you ever plan to play a Merlok deck, you gotta have Merlok War Leader. And again, Merlok decks have been good time and time and again in Hearthstone. So it looks like this one is gonna be a great piece to have for a long, long time to come. Moving on to the number 3 spot here, we have Mountain Giant. And right now, this guy is most commonly seen in Warlock, serving as a great turn 4 play for a cube lock deck that likes to tap often in the early game. They can also be Carnivorous Cubed into giant threats that some decks just can't resolve. And historically, I would say Mountain Giant has been most associated with Warlock in the past too, with things like Handlock. But that's not really the only kinds of decks that run Mountain Giant right now. You don't see these often, but a lot of different people slot this in. Things like Hand Druid, for instance, is a deck that could become good that runs Mountain Giant. I've seen even Paladins running this, even Mages. Pretty rare there, of course, but still, this is the kind of card that lots of different decks just find a home for, because if you have big hands, if you're a control deck, this guy's gonna be a cheap 8/8, and cheap 8/8s can be really, really scary. We've also seen this in all kinds of different combo decks in the past. Of course, in Wild right now, Naga Sea Witch empowers Mountain Giant to some pretty crazy results, but Naga Sea Witch is getting nerfed, so this is not a Wild crafting recommendation anyway, that said. So nonetheless, Mountain Giant, a card that just always pops up, most usually in Warlock because of its hero power. I don't think that's going to change in the future. I think this will remain a very powerful tool for slower Warlock decks, which seem to be very persistent throughout Hearthstone's history. There's always a slow control Warlock deck that's around. That alone might be reason enough to craft Mountain Giant, but because there are other options, other tools, other ways to play this thing, it just becomes a nice card to have and one of the better epic cards to craft in Hearthstone. And now on to the top 2. First off, it's Faceless Manipulator, a card today which again is most commonly seen in Cube Lock. That seems to be a bit of a theme. But beyond that, Faceless Manipulator is still a card that has shown up a lot throughout Hearthstone's history because it just does something really unique and offers options that no other card in the game currently exists outside of Prince Taldaram, I guess. But nonetheless, Faceless Manipulator, classic card that's always around. So in Cube Lock today, of course, it copies cubes and Doom Guards and Void Lords and all kinds of cool stuff like that. In the past, this has been used as a combo enabler with things like Leroy Jenkins, for instance, to get tons of damage across and all kinds of different combo-style decks. It can also just be used as a value piece to copy a Tyrian Forge Ring sometime. So in control decks, often, this just becomes a tech card of sorts, an extra tool to fit different kinds of neat little combo plays in, just a raw value generator on occasion to double up great minions you're already running. with a surprising amount of flexibility across classes and different ways to utilize it as well. It's one of those cards that's just a good thing to have in your collection. And then finally, as we move on to the number 1 spot, this is a card which has taken this spot in the past and is currently the most played neutral epic card in Hearthstone. Once again, because of Cube Block. It's very popular in Cube Block, but any control deck can find a way to play Doomsayer. And in fact, a lot of them do find a way to play Doomsayer because it's just such a cheap and reliable and consistent early game removal tool. This single card can often win you games against aggro decks all on its own. If you play it at the right time, they can't remove it. You steal so much tempo from them because not only does it often destroy the current board that is there, but it often destroys their turn because they don't have any way to spend mana. You can't spend mana into a Doomsayer. You can't play minions, often leaving them with very little to do or non-optimized plays, so they have to do something else instead. So in a weird way, it's this ultimate anti-tempo card. Control decks love it because it creates so many opportunities. It can be comboed with other things like Spreading Plague in the past with Frost Nova, freeze effects like that to demolish enormous boards. So a great tool for any slow deck. A very important asset if you ever want to play control in Hearthstone. So in my mind, one of the most played epic cards ever, or probably actually the number 1 most played epic card ever in the history of Hearthstone. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's very, very strong and a card that you need to have as far as epics are concerned in this game. So to me, the number 1 priority to craft for a general use epic card in the game is Doomsayer. And there you go, guys. That's my list. The 10 best epic cards to craft. Again, Spiteful Summoner, Call to Arms, and Void Lord would be on this list, but who knows where they're going to land. They might not be good enough. Use your discretion there. Use your judgment. If they look like they're still good, they're worth a craft. They're all really strong cards at the moment. That said, beyond that, I have to admit the epic cards in Hearthstone are often a bit unusual. They tend to have more of an emphasis on tech cards or like utility cards. They're not just raw value cards usually, which makes them less good to craft on average than things like legendaries. For instance, Lich King, you can just toss it in any deck and it's fine. Epic cards don't usually work that way. They're usually aligned along a certain archetype or some sort of specific combo, so it's harder to fit them in and harder to make recommendations on the ones to craft, frankly. So yes, this list will serve you. Yes, these are all good epic cards to have. But at the end of the day, in some cases, you might be better off spinning your dust on legendaries or crafting cards that fit specific decks that you're trying to play. Essentially, as always, just use your best judgment when making decisions with crafting. Don't rely on my opinion alone. I can obviously get things wrong. You should always seek second opinions. In fact, I'm sure the comments below will have lots of insights for you. That said, good luck out there with your dust. Thank you for watching, and until next time, game on.